Hey everyone, welcome to today's video where we're gonna look into Nio and their semiconductor business. Over the past couple of years, one of the biggest R&D investments for Nio has been the semiconductor and the designing of their own ADAS chip for level 4, level 5 and so on and so forth, like self-driving cars. And the main competitor currently, and most automotive car manufacturers are using Nvidia chips in one way or another. The latest one is Nvidia Orin, although there's a successor coming in at some point, which is called Nvidia Tor. But the idea with Nio's in-house design is that since the volumes of cars gonna go up substantially, at some point they're gonna sell so many cars that it would make sense for them to actually make their own chips. Why would it make sense? Well, if we start with the volume deliveries for Nio for next year, which are expected according to my own models to sit around 500 to 550,000 cars. If you like to look at the more details on how I arrive at those numbers, please look at my previous video in detail going through monthly deliveries. But I'm essentially currently at a current pace of 40 to 50,000 deliveries every single month currently. Expect Nio to do 500,000 cars next year. Now, that could be changed, if the start of the year is significantly slower than I forecast, maybe that number will be closer to 450,000. But in any case, give or take 500,000 cars for 2026. Very rough numbers. 2027, 650,000 and then 800,000. Now, those two numbers are a little bit, more up in the air. It could be too optimistic, it could be too conservative. But this is just the idea of calculating how much money they are gonna save if they start to use their own in-house Shenji chip for all the cars at some point in the future, maybe 2 or 3 years in the future. Now you can see that starting with the Nio Shenji NX9030 or 9031, that is based on supposedly Samsung's 5nm process. I believe this has to be a EUV process and it's below, let's say, 7nm, so most likely this is a EUV process, quite expensive. Rumors out there has this chip at around 600 or so square millimeters. Why is that important? Well, it's really important, especially if you compare it to the Nvidia chip that is 400 or so square millimeters. You can see also on this image, it's actually relative to the size. You can see that the Shenji square is a bit larger than the Orin square from Nvidia, 600 versus 400 square millimeters. Now, this leads to a whole bunch of different fundamental changes for the cost of these chips. So going to our beloved semi-analysis die calculator and looking at the yield, looking at the 300mm wafer, you can see that I'm assuming that the Shenji chip is around 24mm by 24mm, giving us just around 580 square millimeters. Based on a, let's say, defect density of 0.03, which is, this is a quite mature process. Samsung 5nm has been in the market for quite a while now. 3 or 4 years at this point, and it's quite low defect density. I would expect around, give or take, 100 good dies, 100 full dies, and then maybe 82 good dies, around 84% yield, give or take. It means essentially, if you're new to this, if you have this wafer, this silicon wafer, and you have your pieces of chips, each piece of the cake, so each chip is a cake essentially, piece of a cake, and as you should have with this kind of size of the wafer, 300mm in diameter, 12 inch, let's say you would have around 100 or so, 100 or so dies, of which after some manufacturing defects, you should have 84% yield, i.e. 82 or so good dies of almost 100. Doing the same kind of analysis for the Nvidia Orin chip, remember that chip is smaller, I assume 20 by 20 in dimension, and also since it's rumored to be on some sort of Samsung 8nm with even lower defect density, it is a much cheaper node as well. Potentially doesn't even need to be EUV. Most likely it's not EUV unless it's some very extreme version of the 8nm node that is borderline on the 5. So it could always be that. I don't know. I don't have that inside information. But long story short, since the chip is smaller, it's a, let's say, more legacy node. The yields are higher. Samsung's 8nm should give Nvidia around 148 dies, of which 137 are good. So you can see that the yield is 92.3%. And you get 130 to 140 good dice compared to, let's say, Nio's own Shenji chip of 80 or so dice. Now, these are, again, really, really rough ballpark numbers. So going into my own calculation here, I just assumed slightly different numbers. Assumed that Shenji chip should be around 106 dice per wafer, and I assume that for 2026 they have a yield of 65%, which is probably a little bit on the low side, but I don't know. And then as time goes on, I'm expecting much higher yield. Remember that the 600 square millimeter die is quite substantial. I mean, we are talking like gaming GPU, top of the line chips. So this is a giant chip, like 600 or so square millimeters. Looking at the Nvidia one, it's 400. It's still a big die. I mean, it's substantially larger than probably the PlayStation 5 APU in terms of die size. So these are both big dies. But again, the Nio one is on a more fancier node, and it's also a bigger die size, so the yield is lower. But essentially, that's the reality of the things. Now, you can see that the chip cost I segmented in like a few different segments. I mean, once we calculated for the wafers, you can see that I'm calculating around 69 good dice per wafer. That leaves us with 5,700 or so wafers that Nio needs to satisfy a volume of around 400,000 chips needed for 2026. Why 400,000 chips? Well, if you assume that not every Nio car will have a Shenji chip next year, which is very likely, we know that they started from 89 and going step by step down through the higher end Nio models and the non-one and Firefly. Some of the cars will have 2 of these chips. So I would say that, let's say 400,000 chips needed for next year, which is less than the number of cars sold. It's probably a little bit way too optimistic. Most likely this is a couple of 100,000 or so chips needed for next year in best case scenario. But again, if you sit on better information, please comment in the comment section. Now we also know that the mask is quite expensive at these kind of nodes. Like once we are at like 5 nanometer and 8 nanometer and even further down 3 or 4, the mask, like the mask for the lithography is quite expensive. We are talking anywhere between 20, 30, maybe sometimes even 40 or 50 million depending on node, just for one single mask. So these are like very expensive processes, and again, these are very, very extreme rough estimates. So please feel free to correct me in the comment section. So looking at the details, you can see that I'm assuming around 436 or so US dollar cost for Nio to make this chip. This includes also the automotive functional safety standard ISO 26262. And why do they need to do this ISO test? Well, these are, ADAS self-driving cars. They need to be in the car for 10, 15, 20 years. There's a lot of regulations, a lot of testing, environmental tests that these chips need to go through. And that is why the cost is much more than, let's say, your typical gaming GPU, despite the size being somewhat similar, right? So there's a lot of additional cost coming in there. So why Nio is going this route, in my opinion, is once you see the different cost for Shenji compared to Nvidia Orin. So if you look at the same kind of calculations for Nvidia Orin, you can see it's on 8 nanometer, and once you calculate all the cost for that chip, probably it cost Nvidia, I would say, somewhere around 150 or so US dollar to make that chip. Now this is excluding the ASIL-D according to the ISO 26262 and all the other certifications and the software stack, the CUDA and whatever it is, right? All that kind of stuff is excluded. This is just like the hardware cost, give or take, 150 US dollar. Whereas for Nio, probably we are talking 400 to 500 US dollar, including all the testing, since it's an internal process and they control that. So in any case, once you also look at how much Nvidia most likely is selling these chips to customers like Nio, we are talking about like a 8 to 10x upmark after all the cost for the the CUDA, the software and the certifications that they need to pass. Also, having this chip on essentially available for the lifetime of 15 years. So we are talking about anywhere between most likely 1,100 to 2,000 or so US dollar per chip. This is quite a lot of money, and this is well in line, in my opinion. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but we know that Nio is talking about saving of around 1,400 US dollar per car once they start to introduce the Shenji chip compared to the Nvidia Orin. And some of the cars will have two of the Nvidia Orin chips, so they're gonna save around 2,000 or maybe even 3,000 US dollar per car in some cases. If my calculations is right, I'm sure that some of the numbers are completely wrong, but at least it's the same kind of thinking about how we should think about this. In any case, you can see that at the end of the day, the difference between, let's say, in year 1, 2026, if Nio would have, I don't know, the cost difference between their chip compared to the Nvidia Orin, we're talking about 750 or so US dollar according to this model. Again, this number is I would say somewhere between 500 to 2000 US dollar saving per chip per car. It's a very rough ballpark, but at least it's somewhat of a ballpark. It's a good first step, in my opinion, to look at these kind of calculations. If Nio will then use this chip in 100,000 cars next year, they're gonna save 75 million by using this, this Nio Shenji NX chip. At 500,000 cars for next year, we know that not all of those cars will be, using the Shenji chip. So this is just a model. That would be around 300 to 400 million savings. And as the volume increases year by year, that saving could be, almost 800 million at some point in 2028 at 1 million or so cars. So I would say that there's a realistic reason why Nio is investing in this chip making. Let's see how quickly they can ramp this up. In the grander scheme, 300,000 chips or 500,000 chips is nothing for a company like Samsung. They are making tens of thousands of wafers per month, and probably even hundreds of thousands. And if you look at the number of wafers Nio need for this Shenji chip for the annual supply of 400,000 chips in 2026, that's around 6,000 wafers. So in terms of capacity availability from Samsung and the fabs, it is absolute a no-brainer. It's possible for sure. That is not a big number. Like they can, if they're gonna use these chips in the cars, they will be able to create them. That's not big of a problem. Now the bigger issue is also like how much is the cost of this, like the cost of this entire project of making their own Shenji chip. I don't know, but I'm estimating, like based what I've researched online, couple of 100 million to maybe $500 million. Might be wrong. Some of you in the comment sections previously have said it is way cheaper. I don't know. But I think like just the simple fact that the mask is costing like tens of millions of US dollar, and looking online, they say that, at 5 nanometer, designing a chip, it's at least a few $100 million, unless I'm completely wrong. But again, feel free to correct me in the comment section. So based on all of this, I would say, yeah, actually I see this like a good investment if they have a clear plan to use all these chips in Nio cars very, very soon. Like within next year, if they can have half of the fleet having this, everything essentially beyond the Firefly models and the cheaper Onvo models, everything else higher up should use their own Shenji chip. That would give them quite a lot of savings. You can see also just this infographic that, yeah, there's either two ways. You go with Nvidia, then you have to spend like 1,200 or so US dollar per car or per chip. Some cars might have two chips like the ET9 or some of the higher end cars. That would be a couple of $1,000 or $3,000 going straight to Nvidia's pockets, right? One way to look at these kind of numbers is, are these numbers realistic? Well, we know that Nvidia's automotive revenue is like in the hundreds of millions every quarter, especially when it comes to the chip design. I'm assuming less than 1 million Nvidia Orin chip sales in 2023 annually or in 2024. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. So it's like a slow kind of increase in terms of the automotive market, how quickly they are like using these powerful chips like the Orin or Shenji. But I do believe that market is growing very fast, and there are some articles out there where Jensen Huang is speaking about 5 billion sales in Nvidia automotive for 2023. So I would say there is definitely a demand out there for these kind of chips going ahead, since also the level 4 and level 5 will need higher computing power. So I'm not worried about that at all. But I would say that, for Nio to save 800 million or so every single year on this, they need to sell 1 million cars with this kind of level of computing performance. And currently, Nvidia barely sells that number just in 2024 or 2025. So these are expectations based on future growth, future sales. Will Nio accept that the lower end cars like on the Onvo segment and even some of the Fireflies will have the same capability like the main Nio brand or the ET9 or ES8? I don't know. Maybe that would put some cannibalization. Why would you offer the same quality, full self-driving for across your entire fleet, while others argue that this is more like a Tesla model, that this is such an important safety feature that no matter what segment you need to have a minimum level of safety quality. So it's a different, let's say, two different schools there. I don't know, but in my opinion, these investments look pretty legit when it comes from Nio's side. Again, feel free to comment in the comment section about the numbers and estimations, and thanks for your time, and see you in the next one.